Chapter 109, Wizard Car Chase. April 8, 1996, Bullock Residence, a little Hangleton, England, next Pav. 110, Travis Radner. Horcruxes left. 6, Harry, Tierra, Larket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Jennifer Bullock was at her wit's end. She'd always thought that her husband had been a little strange. However, he'd gone completely off the wall ever since the therapist had recovered the repressed memory of his being kidnapped by the half-trained wizards and used as a guinea pig in some bizarre experiment. She understood his ill will towards the wizards. However, she had put her foot down when he had mentioned that he was thinking of creating a Britain for Humans chapter, which was devoted entirely to ferreting out wizards with Muggle parents. Britain for Humans had made the news a lot recently. Supposedly, the authorities had just arrested 2 of their leaders on charges ranging from child endangerment to being a public nuisance. She had heard bad things about the movement and did not want her husband involved, especially if it required attacking or persecuting wizards. Philip had grumbled about this a little, but had eventually given in. Had her husband started taking drugs about the same time as the explosion in the cemetery? This type of behavior was so unlike him. Yet the doctor she had described her husband's symptoms to quietly didn't believe that he was operating under the influence of drugs. If anything, it seemed almost as if he'd been possessed by a demon who didn't like wizards. Jennifer had scoffed at that, telling the therapist that there were no such things as demons. The therapist, of course, had responded by saying that 3 months ago he'd have said that there were no such things as wizards. If wizards couldn't exist, why couldn't demons? The explanation was as likely as his being abducted by the wizards. Neither she nor Philip had been particularly religious. However, the comment about the demon had her worried. So she went to her church and set up an appointment to have a spiritual leader perform an exorcism on her husband. She was not entirely surprised to find that the exorcism had no effect. If anything, her husband had found the whole thing rather amusing. The final straw came when she walked out into the garden, only to find her husband hissing at something on the ground. What did he think he was? A snake? As if that hadn't been bad enough, a decent-sized snake had actually been in the garden at the time. Jennifer had immediately raced back into the kitchen and slammed a frying pan onto the reptile's head. Her husband, of course, complained that Natchash hadn't been doing any harm and shouldn't have been killed. Natchash, apparently, had been the snake. Good grief, he thought he could talk to snakes too now. For the first time in her life, she began to contemplate divorce. She thanked God that the kids were already grown. Several of her friends had tried to talk her out of it, stating that they'd overcome bigger obstacles during their marriage. Jennifer had countered, however, that Philip turning into a raving lunatic who thought he could talk to snakes was something that no one could have possibly suspected. Right now, she was in the kitchen, trying to cook dinner. She had taken up cooking again as a major hobby. For the first time since college, it demanded all her attention and took her mind off the problems with Philip. She had just started working on the tuna casserole when the doorbell rang. Her husband said that he'd get it, which was good. Safely secluded in the kitchen, she heard the door open and her husband greeting the guest. "May I help you?" A man's voice responded. "I believe so, sir. My name is Lucius de Mort. I'm here to pick up my nephew Paul." Jennifer grunted. Paul de Mort. Who the hell was Paul de Mort? She didn't recognize the name, and she doubted that her husband did, either. She fully expected him to tell the guest that he'd gotten the wrong house. Instead, she heard her husband say, almost as if he was being prompted, "Yup, Paul de Mort is here. Please, close the door and slide the curtains over the windows. He's a bit allergic to light." Jennifer rolled her eyes as she heard the doors and curtains moving. Allergic to light. What had he gotten into now? She couldn't let her attention waver too much from the food, however. What happened next, however, changed her mind about the food. There was an odd thump in the room next door, almost like a body falling to the floor. It was followed by a weak, raspy voice he'd never heard before. "Welcome, Uncle Lucius. I've been expecting you." The visitor responded. It's good to see you again, my lord. I take it you have the bone in this house. I do, Lucius. All we need to do now is go to the burrow and take some blood from our dear friend Harry. Once we've got that, we're all set. Wormtail can perform the ritual when he's ready. Jennifer dropped everything and started heading towards the door to the living room. Had Philip just gotten involved with a group of Satanists? She didn't know who this Wormtail was, but judging by the person's name, he didn't sound particularly pleasant. And judging from Paul de Mort's voice, the man seemed older than his uncle. Something very strange was going on here. She opened the door, took one look around the room, and gasped. Meanwhile, the people already in the room stared at her in surprise. Her husband's body was lying on the floor. He looked dead, or at least very badly hurt. Next to him was something which looked like a shrunken version of an old man, completely naked. She couldn't tell if it was an injured child or an old dwarf. Finally, standing in the doorway was an elegantly dressed gentleman with blonde hair and an elaborate walking stick. The man exuded wealth and power. The three people stared at each other for a second. Finally, the old man spoke. "Get rid of her, Lucius, and let's get out of here." The blonde man nodded and extracted something which looked suspiciously like a magic wand from his cane. Bloody hell, this was probably one of the insane wizards who had experimented on her husband. She had no idea what he was going to do, but she didn't want to find out. She screamed and raced into the kitchen, slamming the door in the man's face. Meanwhile, the man shouted a strange word, something which sounded like abracadabra. There was a green flash and a rather large bang. Jennifer didn't like this at all. This man was indeed nutters, she thought. He had just incapacitated her husband and had this nephew of his as a backup. 2-on-1 with at least one of the enemies a wizard. It was time to run. She slammed doors behind her, heading for the garage. If she could get to the car, perhaps she'd be able to get away from this guy. She made a mental note to run over any brooms she saw in the area. If they were relying on brooms as their means of escape, they'd probably find themselves in a bit of a bind. She heard the man following her, taunting her that she wouldn't be able to escape. She reached the garage and jumped into the car. The blonde man burst into the garage seconds later and fired a green beam at her. It smashed into the rear window and shattered it. Gunning the motor, she burst out of the house and headed down the street. She didn't see any unfamiliar brooms or cars in the area. It looked like she'd caught a break. The man had arrived on foot. She headed towards the police station to report the incident and ask for protection. She had gone approximately 1 block when something abruptly materialized in the middle of the road. It was the blonde man. He had somehow managed to teleport from her house to right in front of her. The man raised his wand. Jennifer ducked, and another green beam shattered her windshield. Realizing that the next one would likely be aimed at her head, she tried to keep her head low. Unfortunately, that made it more difficult for her to see the road. Before she realized it, she'd run off the side of the road and hit the curb. Instinctively, she stuck her head up over the steering wheel to see what had happened. The blonde man was waiting for her, and this time he didn't miss. 5 minutes later, Lucius Malfoy apparated out of Little Hengleton, leaving a rather confused town behind. At his side, traveling by side-along apparition, was a small child wearing 2 large clothes stolen from the Bullock house. In the child's pants pocket was a small piece of burnt bone. Chapter 110. Vila at a predominantly male college. April 8, 1996, near Phi Beta Epsilon Fraternity, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cambridge, Massachusetts, United States of America. Horcruxes left. 6. Harry, Tiara, Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Travis Radner swore under his breath. He should have known not to bring a Vila onto the MIT campus, particularly when the ratio of men to women was approximately 2:1. Poor Jeanette had been completely out of her element. She had made it out of the eye-entry door out into the MacGregor courtyard without incident. Unfortunately, that was about as far as she made it. Several members of Phi Beta Epsilon, who sitting outside on their roof deck, started ogling and whistling at her like mad. Jeanette, of course, began staring at them curiously, probably because they were been the first Muggles she'd ever seen. This only encouraged them further, and eventually they started taking their shirts off and making muscles even though it was barely 55 degrees outside, and they weren't exactly the most gorgeous men in the world. Radner eventually had to bodily interpose himself between the two men and their quarry to prevent them from running down and chasing her around. Things just got worse from there. A young man on a bike turned to stare at her instead of the road, ran into the curb, and fell on his face. Radner, thinking of the diplomatic opportunity here, took out his wand to help with the injury. Unfortunately, the biker had had the bad luck to make his tumble right outside the entrances to Burton and Kappa Sigma. This left the Vila at the mercy of two more fraternity boys and a Jewish student from Burton, who promptly walked away from the woman he'd left the dorm with to chat with Jeanette. By the time Radner was done healing the fallen boy, she'd been handed 2 phone numbers, given an email address, and asked if she was Jewish. From what Radner knew of the woman, she'd probably never met any Jews and had no idea what a telephone or computer was. He instructed Jeanette to put her hood over her head so no one could see her. That didn't help much, as people walking down the sidewalk towards them could see her more or less. One poor fellow walked into a tree, tearing Radner away again. By the time the secretary had returned, Jeanette promptly asked him who Princess Leia was and whether Muggles princesses always wore slave outfits. His explanation was interrupted by a car horn honking at Jeanette, who, of course, lowered her hood to stare at the fascinating Muggle vehicle. That does it, he thought, holding her hand and carefully making sure not to look at her face, for at 73, even he had a few urges, he cast a disillusionment charm over her, making her invisible to everyone. That worked fine until someone literally walked into her in Lobby 7. Both Jeanette and the woman who had collided with her fell down in surprise. This gave Radner a chance to extricate himself from this awkward situation by apologizing to the fallen woman and helping her up. He couldn't just leave, after all, because he also couldn't see the disillusioned Vila and was worried he'd leave her behind. Eventually, he felt Jeanette's hand squeeze as he could tell she was now a little frightened, and continued his journey down the hall. Finally, he reached his destination, room 6120. The biology professor was already there, as was a large audience. It seemed that the announcement had gone out in time. There were at least 100 people in the room, he thought. Of course, maybe 70 of them were male. He heard a whisper from the empty air next to them. Tell them that if any of them even touch me, I'm going to turn them all into toads. The only reason I haven't gone hoppy on the men we've already encountered was because a few of them was cute. Besides, you told me that I'm serving as a bit of a diplomat here. Radner grinned and looked over at the biologist, who nodded and held up his slides. I'm all set. Where's the young lady you were telling me about? Radner nodded at the empty space next to him. Right here. She's holding my hand. I've made her invisible because Vila, well, have a tendency to affect men in a certain way. The biologist looked around the room. You mean she's naked? They don't wear clothes? Radner smiled. No, doctor, they wear clothes, however. Well, do you know the Iliad and the Odyssey? Remember the story about the sirens. They lured many members of Odysseus's crew to their deaths and nearly seduced Odysseus himself. Those were Vila. The woman I'm about to expose could very well pass for one of the sirens. Keep an eye on the audience, would you? I don't want this to get ugly, partially, because Vila can turn into hideous creatures when angered. The biologist nodded. Good to know. Well, let's get this show on the road. Radner nodded and raised his voice. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special press conference of the American Department of Magic and Life Science Department at MIT. We have come to announce a new breakthrough and add another branch to the tree of humanity known as Homo sapiens. The audience started talking excitedly among themselves. Radner raised his hand. Before we begin, there is something very important you must know. This is the species associated with the sirens, the women Odysseus encountered in the Odyssey. They are all female, and extremely attractive females to boot. Most men will fall head over heels for them. The audience's excitement picked up a notch as Radner continued. I ask all men here to consider carefully whether they have the maturity to stay. You will almost certainly develop a crush on this woman. You are to leave her alone regardless of what your nether regions are telling you. If you do not think you will be able to control yourselves, you may leave now. Rest assured that if you upset her, she will turn you into a toad. The biologist cut in at this point. We could always use some more toads for our experiments. We've been running short. Radner watched the crowd. Most of the men gritted their teeth and stayed in their seats. A few left, however. When the audience had settled back down, he drew a deep breath. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce a member of Homo sapiens serena, commonly known as a Vila. Her name is Miss Jeanette de Bartholomew. She has a master's degree from an institution of advanced education in Chicago. Be advised that she will be wearing a hood so you can't see her face that clearly. She has chosen to do this to prevent any inappropriate behavior among guests with a Y chromosome. With that, he removed the disillusionment charm. A good 2/3 of the room groaned, oohed, or ahed. Even with the hood on, most of the men's eyes went as wide as saucers. Several fidgeted in their seats. Radner cast a baleful glare around the room, and within a few minutes, everyone had settled back down. Radner continued. Vila are magical humanoids of great beauty and intelligence. They are sentient, just like you and me, and are to be treated as such. They tend to take offense if someone calls them anything other than human. Jeanette put her hands on her hips and grunted. That, they, includes me. Rest assured, you don't want to see me angry. Trust me. All Vila have a form of shape-shifting ability, and you don't want to see what I can turn into when I'm mad. One of the students cut in, like the Incredible Hulk. Jeanette looked at the speaker, puzzled, as Radner and the biologist both glared at him. I'm sorry, I'm not sure who that is. The only Muggles I've heard about so far are Princess Leia, Joe HSU, Gillian Anderson, and David Pope. There was also a young man in, with a little round hat, who asked me if I was Jewish. The crowd laughed as Radner turned to her and explained. The Incredible Hulk is a fictional Muggle superhero who turns into an extremely powerful monster when he gets angry. He gets really big and strong, his skin turns green, and he goes berserk. The Vila gaped at him. He's an animagus or metamorph magus. The biologist laughed. No, ma'am, he's an entirely fictional character, and he does not cast spells. He uses superhuman endurance and strength to overcome adversaries. Jeanette laughed, and half the men groaned wistfully. Ah, in that case, I am a bit like him. I get mad, and I change form and become really scary. Radner didn't like where this was going. Linking up a living person with a fantasy superhero was not a good idea. He needed to change the subject quickly. Vila are an extremely rare subspecies of humanity. Jeanette here suspects that there are fewer than 3 million Vila on the planet. She claims that several well-known supermodels, who will remain nameless, are Vila but have not told the Muggles. One of the men in the room chuckled at that. Not surprising, given the way I react to them. The biologist cut in. Indeed, my good man. At any rate, Secretary Radner has known about Vila for a while. Traditionally, they have gone under the name Homo serena because it was believed that Vila could only produce live offspring with wizards, not Muggles. The general consensus is that in order to be a member of Homo sapiens, the species in question must be able to produce living offspring with Muggles. Radner smiled. During the tour of Entry a while back, we encountered a Muggle woman who appeared to have some Vila traits. Intrigued, we took some blood samples from this woman, some random Muggle women, and some Vila. Was it possible that, against all odds, a Vila bred with a Muggle? He paused and nodded to the biologist. who continued the presentation. The answer, as it turns out, was undeniably yes. We believe that the Muggle woman in question is roughly 132 Vila. She knew of no wizarding ability or unusually seductive women in her family for at least 3 generations. She has neither of the wizarding genes. This meant that at some point in the late 19th or early 20th century, a Vila mated with a Muggle and produced live offspring. And there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. Homo sapiens serena. The biologist then went on discussing various proteins and chromosome markers. Genes V1, V35 didn't seem all that interesting to most of the people, primarily because they were all staring at a visibly irritated Jeanette. Eventually, one of the students raised his hand. Radner nodded to him. I see we have a question from the audience. The student winked at his friend. Is it possible for magical ability to not appear in a child, even if both parents are wizards? Radner nodded. Yes, such children are called squibs. Why do you ask? Simple, Mr. Secretary. We cannot prove that this Muggle's ancestor did not have wizard ability at the time he mated with the Vila. After all, the Vila's son could have been a squib and raised as a Muggle. Is that not true? The biologist slowly nodded. It's possible. However, squibs are not very common. I'd say the odds of that happening are relatively low. But it's non-zero. The biologist nodded. It's non-zero, but very low, less than 2%. The people in charge have already added the sapiens to the name of the species. They believe the error is low enough to justify it. The speaker smiled. In that case, it behooves that we, the students from MIT, help the advancement of science by determining this new species' status once and for all. We're all Muggles, and she's a Vila. Does that suggest anything to you? For the sake of science, of course. Radner and the biologist stared at each other, troubled. The student had a valid point. Neither of them could deny it, and if they admitted it. Jeanette answered for them. Smiling sweetly at the crowd, she said, You have a point, young man. That would be a very worthwhile experiment, especially if you looked outside the room to find a Vila who would be willing to participate. Looking inside the room won't do you any good, as the Vila in this room are not interested in your proposal. Men groaned, and the speaker's confidence wavered. But Jeanette's smile broadened. I'll give you to the count of 3 to stop staring at me and leave the room. 1, 2. The biologist started humming the theme song for The Incredible Hulk. Jeanette's eyes narrowed. 2.5. The student bolted, allowing Radner and the biologist to conclude the talk in peace. Chapter 111. Remembrall versus Math Test. April 9, 1996, Room 2190, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cambridge, Massachusetts, United States of America. Horcruxes left. 6. Harry, Tiara, Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Jason Morgenstern stared in disbelief at the examination paper. He had studied all night for this exam, having gone so far as to tell Guinevere not to visit. He thought he'd understood the text from to back and had gone over most of the problem sets. Yet the test still seemed to be giving him problems. Judging from the questions he'd answered so far, he'd be lucky to get a 70 on this one. The only good sign, however, was that looking around the room at his fellow classmates, he wasn't alone. He didn't see one happy face in the room. 6. Suppose you have a broken calculator. You turn it on, and you have a 0 show up in the display. Show that you can cause any positive integer to appear in the display. The catch. The only buttons which work are the square root button, square button, tangent button, cosine button, inverse button, and 1x. He thought about it and thought about it. Finally, he came across a solution. It was very complicated, but it seemed to work. Grinning, he wrote it down and headed off to the next problem. He had just finished reading the next question when he saw a dim red light from inside his backpack. Frowning, he glanced down at the backpack and saw that the Remembrall had turned on. Great, he thought. Now I have to deal with this test while simultaneously being pestered that I forgot something. I can't focus on both things at the same time. Let's get the test out of the way, that's more important. The next two questions were relatively straightforward. It gave him at least a little bit of time to think about what he'd forgotten. He had his keys that had been embarrassing last time. He'd been a bit surprised that he'd noticed the remember-all midway through the test. He figured he'd have seen it glowing right after he'd taken his seat. Then a thought occurred to him, something which made him drop his pencil momentarily. Could it be that the remember-all had gone on during the examination? If that was the case, it was alerting him to a mistake in one of the earlier questions. He suspected that it had been question 6, the one about the broken calculator. After all, he'd first noticed the red glow right after he'd gone on to question 7. He didn't know what to do. Was this cheating? He didn't want to cheat, and having something tell him that he had made a mistake during an exam could be seen as a cheat. On the other hand, he must have once known the material and therefore studied it. Otherwise, the remember-all would not have gone on after he had made the mistake. There was one way to find out. He went back to question 6 and looked over his answer. Consider the number you have initially on the screen. Consider that to be tan 2x, hit the square root button. You now have tan x hit inverse tangent. This will give you x hit cosine to get cos x, then hit 1x to give you sec 2x. Since tan 2x plus 1 equals sec 2x, the process will increase the value originally in the display by 1. You can repeat this indefinitely to get any positive integer. It seemed okay to me. He looked it over for maybe 30 more seconds. Then he saw the flaw. Hit cosine to get cos x, then hit 1x to give you sec 2x. He forgot to put the square in. What he should have said was, hit cosine to get cos x, hit the square button to get cos 2x, then hit 1x to give you sec 2x. He hesitated at first. Would he have seen the mistake had it not been for the remember-all? He wasn't sure. However, he thought he probably would have done so. He always left time at the end of an exam to double-check all of his answers. He figured that he'd have caught it later on anyway. Taking a deep breath, he made the correction. Seconds later, the remember-all turned off. Good God, he thought. I was right. It was alerting me to the mistake on the test. It turned out that the last 3 questions were extremely difficult. He barely had time to jot down a half-baked answer to question 11 when the bell rang announcing the end of the examination. He was ashamed to admit it, but the remember-all had given him an advantage here. It had saved question 6. And judging from the reactions of the other people in the room, there weren't going to be many high scores. He looked around the room for one of his fraternity brothers. David nodded at him, groaned, and started following him back down the labyrinth of Building 2's corridors back towards the Infinite Corridor, and from there across the street into the section of campus with most of the dorms and frats. He had to confess, it was the right thing to do. So, somewhere between Crest and McCormick, he reached into his backpack and pulled out the now-dark remember-all. David looked at it curiously. What is that thing? Is it a magical item of some sort? I saw Guinevere gave it to you. Jason grunted. It's a remember-all. It glows to warn you that you've forgotten something. I often carry it around to remind myself of Guinevere. However, I have reason to believe that this may be a problem. A problem? Why? He jerked his head back at the main buildings. I take it you had as difficult of a time with that test as I did. David rolled his eyes. Difficult. It was impossible. I'd be lucky to get a 50. I never figured out questions 2, 6, and 10. Jason nodded and pointed at the remember-all. David, I think this thing gave me the answer to question 6. The broken calculator 1. I had gone on to question 7 when I noticed this glowing. The only explanation I could think of was that I had made a mistake in question 6. He paused. As it turned out, I was right. I missed part of the explanation. The ball turned off as soon as I corrected the mistake. David's eyes went wide. You can use that thing to cheat on tests. Jason gesticulated wildly with his hands. I didn't mean to. I had no idea it would do that. What do I do? Should I turn myself in? Should I give it back to Guinevere? David thought for a moment. What I'd do is keep it in my room unless you get a take-home exam, in which case you stick it in a closet until you're finished with the test. The closets don't lock, and if it's in the open, won't my roommate take it then? He's not doing all that well in one of the course 16 courses, and he's already used it a couple of times to remind him of ROTC meetings and so forth. He's probably going to put two and two together. Then put it under lock and key and invent some kind of nonsense, which says that there is a 1% cumulative chance each time other than you or Guinevere touches the device that the person who touches it will turn into a cockroach. Jason stared at him. What? People are going to believe it. I don't want to lie to people here, and Guinevere says that people need to know the truth about what wizards can and can't do. Besides, I've already let him touch it, which sort of discredits the theory that it's dangerous. David thought once more. That's a personal gift from Guinevere, right? Say Guinevere has just told you that she doesn't want it out of your sight. She wants you to remember you always, and she most definitely doesn't want this precious gift shared with other people. Jason got the point immediately. You know, David, that might work. It sounds like something she'd do. I'll do that. Thanks for the help, my friend. Don't mention it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to visit someone in Baker. I'll see you at dinner. Chapter 112. Patrick Dursley Burgess's New Ally. April 9, 1996. Dursley Burgess Household, Westboro, Kansas, United States of America. Horcruxes left. 6. Harry, Tierra, Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Patrick Dursley Burgess couldn't believe how quickly his anti-wizard movement had spread. Not only had America for Humans reached 50 chapters, several foreign countries had started their own World for Humans organization. His cousin's chapter in Britain had gotten to the point where it had actually attempted to attack a Catholic church on the grounds that the Pope was a wizard. On the other hand, everything wasn't coming up roses for his cousin. The investigation into the church attack had brought the cops to Vernon's house, where they had arrested him on suspicion of planning the attacks and on child abuse charges stemming from his mistreatment of Harry Potter. Vernon had lost custody of the two children, and from what Patrick had been told, Dudley had been put in an orphanage for the time being. Patrick had spoken with Vernon's lawyer and had offered to host Dudley. He'd been shot down immediately, however. The British government didn't want the two children in different countries, and Harry couldn't leave England. Furthermore, Dudley, who had surprisingly warmed to Harry over the past few months, had considered moving into the borough with Harry. The Ministry of Magic had opposed that vehemently on the grounds that having the son of the founder of Britain for Humans in a wizarding home was just a recipe for disaster. He hoped Vernon would come out of this all right. Before he went to bed each night, he prayed that God would deliver his cousin from the forces surrounding him and put him in a position to help Patrick and the rest of World for Humans finish off the wizards for good. He looked at the clock in his home office and saw that it was almost time for his next appointment. One of his duties as the head of the Westboro's America for Humans chapter was to interview promising candidates from the Westboro area and initiate them into the group. He would then introduce them to Phelps and Pitmoss so that they could get moral support and guidance. The two religious leaders were quite inspirational, and they soon kicked the new members' passion into overdrive. The interviews Patrick liked best, however, were few and far between. They involved cases where a small, local anti-wizard militia wanted to join up with his own. These militias were often very well organized and would serve America for Humans quite well under their own officers and bylaws. His next appointment was of a representative of one of these militias. His name was Mahatma Damil, and he was from India. He was a member of the Council of Nine, the planning committee for an obscure but very highly organized, if Damil's propaganda was true, group known as the Foundation. Patrick had never heard of the Foundation before. However, that was not surprising. These militias often stayed underground until it was time to strike, and when they struck, they really put themselves on the map, either assassinating wizards or blowing up buildings. The clerk in his office struck 10. Seconds later, there was a knock on the door. Patrick's eyebrows shot up. A high-ranking officer from an organization who actually showed up exactly on time. These guys must have military discipline in their organization. He glanced at the door. "Who is it?" The visitor responded in heavily accented English. "Mahatma Damiel of the Foundation, sir. You've been expecting me." "Indeed I have, Mr. Damiel. Come on in and have a seat." The door opened, and a tall Indian man walked in wearing a business suit. He looked supremely confident and was carrying a walking stick. The guy had money, Patrick thought. Money and power. This foundation may be a valuable ally. Damiel had dark hair and a muscular physique. There were a few medals on his chest. He recognized a few of them as decorations from service in Vietnam. He'd been injured a few times and had been decorated for bravery and discipline. Wow. The Indian sat down and shook Patrick's hand. The man had a very strong grip, definitely an ex-soldier. Patrick caught a glimpse of a tattoo on the man's right arm when Damiel had offered it. He couldn't see much, but it seemed to be a skull with a snake. Damiel followed Patrick's gaze and nodded. "Ah, yes, the tattoo. It's the insignia of my old Vietnam troop, Mr. Dursley Burgress. A death's head skull closing its jaws on our common enemy, the serpent which is the bane of all our existence." Patrick chuckled. "A very apt symbol for both Vietnam and America for humans, if I should say so myself. Do you want anything to drink or eat?" Damiel shook his head. "No, thank you, sir. I'm all set. I brought my own food. Religious restrictions." Patrick's opinion of this man shot up even more. He had no idea if the man was actually religious. However, it was a convenient excuse for him not to eat someone else's food and find himself poisoned a few hours later. This guy was smart and powerful, and he had served in Vietnam. Very interesting. "I see you were in Vietnam. Did you see any action there?" "Yes, Mr. Dursley Burgress." "Call me Patrick, my friend. That hyphenated last name has always been a bit of a mouthful." Damiel grinned. "Yes, Patrick. I served on some elite units and helped clear out Khmer Rouge positions on several classified raids. One of these medals comes from me risking my own life to take out an enemy sniper and save an injured comrade." Patrick recognized the award. "Indeed, I saw. At any rate, tell me about your foundation. How is it organized, and how can you help us?" Damiel lay back in his chair. "The foundation is very large and organized. It's led by a fellow named Daniel Dillman, whose whereabouts I am unfortunately unable to disclose. He's the chairman of the Council of Nine, the planning committee which oversees most of our operations. I have the privilege of being on the planning committee." Patrick nodded. "I've heard. What type of stuff do you guys do?" Damiel shrugged. "We use military-style operations against wizarding targets. We've shot down a few wizards here and there with snipers. You'd be amazed how much of a splatter you get when a wizard falls off a broom from 1,000 feet. Patrick laughed. "I can imagine. Where'd you get the guns and the training?" "Personal weapons plus Vietnam experience, Patrick. We've also got some hidden RPGs and improvised explosive devices which we're willing to detonate to further our objectives." Patrick whistled. "Jesus Christ, you are organized. I'm impressed. Sure, we'd love to have you on board. Is Mr. Dillman willing to take orders from me?" Damiel nodded. "Yes, Patrick, he is. He'd prefer to be on your planning committee, but if all else fails, he's willing to be the head of a local branch. Having a group without the name, for humans in it, would be a good way to disguise ourselves." "Indeed it would, Mr. Damiel. You guys seem to be very good. I take it that in exchange for membership in our organization, you'll be willing to provide us with some of this material." "Yes, Patrick. Dillman has told me to tell you that he intends to do exactly that. What's more, he's got a mission he wants to run by you. Believe me, you're going to like this. It's going to be big. It's going to make that church attack look like child's play." Patrick's eyes widened. "Really? What were you thinking?" Daniel grinned. As I told you, we've got some big explosive devices. Dillman was thinking of depth charging the Quabin reservoir with a large bomb. I doubt the spells holding out the water will be able to protect against a huge Muggle explosion. If those spells fail. Patrick's jaw dropped as he realized the implications. Shuddering in pleasure, he finished the statement. You knock out the entire American Department of Magic along with its false prophet. We chop off the head of the snake, much as your tattoo was suggesting. Once the head is chopped off, the tail may wriggle for a while, but the snake is still dead. Exactly, Patrick. What do you think? We have the material to make the device and should be able to perform the attack by Memorial Day. Patrick stood up, smiling ear to ear. Welcome aboard, gentlemen. Welcome aboard. Daniel shook the man's hand as they sealed the deal. Inside, however, he grinned. The man had fallen for it. Dilmy had thought he would, and he had. He thought that this would just knock out a few wizards, and that was it. That in itself would be good for both some of the Death Eaters and America for humans. However, there was Voldemort himself and the rest of Al-Qaeda, an expression which translated as the Foundation in English. Al-Qaeda had always wanted to do something big to the United States, and these amateurs were the perfect tool to use. Yes, Dana would flood. Dilmy had been pretty sure about that. However, if Dana flooded and the doors to eye-entry were open at the time, most of Boston would be underwater, and what was left would have no water supply. He doubted Patrick realized that. Voldemort would have knocked out one major adversary, and Al-Qaeda would have its moment in the sun. Of course, if the plot were exposed, Al-Qaeda could just deny all involvement and have the axe fall on America for humans, and only America for humans. He, Daniel, was prepared for that eventuality and had told Dilmy he'd apparate out of there discreetly before he was caught. Osama bin Laden would have loved to see this. Chapter 113, Passover at Al-Aqsa. April 10, 1996, 7th day of Passover. Al-Aqsa Mosque with Jerusalem Horcruxes left. 6. Harry, Tiara, Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup. The Kohen Gadol, formerly the imam in charge of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, was still in shock over how the first day of Passover had gone over at the mosque. Now it was the tail end of the holiday, day 7. Judging from what had happened on the first day, he had to be ready for lots of surprises. He had tried to talk Samuel out of inviting everyone to visit the mosque for the holiday. The Jews would not set foot on the mountain, claiming it was holy ground, and they might step inside the forbidden area which had enclosed the old Jewish temple's Holy of Holies. Samuel didn't buy that at all. He explained that the Holy of Holies had been, in fact, in the roped-off area at the center of the mosque, where people were not allowed to tread. There was no risk of offending the Almighty as a result. He had then claimed that many Muslims would be offended at having unbelievers in the mosque. Samuel had responded by saying that as long as they believed in the God of Abraham, they were to be welcomed as believers. Time and time again, he had tried to convince Samuel that what the prophet was proposing, although well-intentioned and certainly beneficial for unifying the three faiths, would not work in practice as the three sects had too many differences between them nowadays. Samuel had answers for everything. Finally, at his wit's end, he said that he did not believe that he was worthy of being the high priest for the combined Abrahamic faith. How could he minister to non-Muslims if he was not as familiar with their customs? How would he be able to end 2,000 years of strife? Samuel had, of course, chuckled at this. He explained that Moses had asked the same question and had managed to become a world-renowned political and spiritual leader. Allah had placed the imam in the mosque at this particular moment for a reason, Samuel said. Allah had chosen him for this purpose, just as he had chosen people like Moses, the Arabian prophet, and the prophet John Paul listened to. All three men had proven to be excellent spiritual leaders. God had wrought miracles to educate this men before. What was to say that he would not do so again? Eventually, the imam gave in. Samuel was adamant and believed in him. It wasn't quite the point where the prophet himself had returned to declare him the Mahdi, but it was pretty close. He soon convinced himself that Allah had chosen him for this purpose, and it was not up to him to question his will. It had taken him a while to figure out how he'd handle Passover. However, he did it. It had taken a lot of discussion with Samuel and the rest of the mask staff. Eventually, they had come across a tentative solution. Virtually everyone was convinced it would blow up in their faces, but it was worth a shot. And if it didn't work, it would convince Samuel that things weren't as easy to fix as he thought. The mere thought of bringing sacramental wine into the mask nearly brought the whole house of cards down. Eventually, they compromised by using fruit juice. 6 days ago, he had risen early to see a small but steady stream of pilgrims of all three faiths waiting at the gate that led to the Temple Mount. Most of the visitors were Muslims, but he did see a few men with kippah and a couple of Christian monks. Much to his surprise, there had been women among them. He had had to explain that women would not be permitted in the main sanctuary. However, they would be welcome to sit in a courtyard outside the sanctuary and listen to the sermons and so forth. Pilgrims had been given appropriately modest clothing and told to remove their shoes at the gate. They had all been checked for weapons, though the security check had been placed outside the gate so that the Temple Mount remained a sacred site without any references to war. Men had been given simple white robes, while women had been presented with burqas. Several of the non-Muslim women had complained, but the Kohen Gadol had put his foot down. No one was going to face God, whatever name people chose to call him, with any shred of impropriety. The pilgrims were expected to adhere to an ascetic lifestyle while inside the mosque. Silence was to be maintained whenever possible, and men and women were to be segregated. There was to be no food or drink inside the sanctuary, with the exception of water. People who had obviously come to the mosque as tourists only would be asked politely to leave so as to not disrespect the importance of the day. The enforcement of the dress code had more or less expected by the pilgrims. However, they had soon realized that some things were going to be different. Many of the Jewish pilgrims had brought animals, presumably to be sacrificed in the old rite. The Kohen Gadol had explained that there were to be no more sacrifices. Instead, he had asked the pilgrims to hand over the animals so they could be used to feed the poor or sold for charity. Several of the Christian pilgrims had been carrying crosses. The imam had told them that idols were not permitted and that it would be inappropriate to mourn the death of a prophet on a festive day. Needless to say, this had made the people a bit curious as to what was going on. Some people had been offended, and the imam had to explain that things had changed over all these years. After all, there was no need for sacrifices because people no longer lived in an agricultural society. There was now a better way to communicate with the divine, one which was more suited for modern society. The pilgrims had made their way into the central area appropriate for their gender and seated in a room designed for introspection. Several people, primarily Muslims, had sat on carpets. Others sat on chairs. The two groups looked at each other warily but didn't say anything. Samuel had then come up to give a speech, and it had been a speech no one had expected to hear. He had welcomed the people for the festival and explained that there were two purposes for the holiday. First, there was the obvious one, liberation from Egypt. He explained that it was important to remember that the pilgrims' ancestors had all come from the same place, Egypt, perhaps biologically, perhaps culturally. They were all one people who could very easily still be Egyptian, peasants, had it not been for what was believed to have been divine intervention. This inevitably led to Palestinian pilgrims complaining that they couldn't celebrate a holiday like this under Israeli domination. Samuel had countered by saying that the Israelis were still monotheists, and that state of Israel seemed a much more benevolent place than ancient Egypt or even Samuel's Israel for that matter. The pilgrims were then given small pieces of unleavened bread to experience this shared background. It was then, however, that things got interesting. Samuel had also explained that the secondary purpose of Passover was to remind people that it was possible for them to liberate themselves from unhealthy habits and past viewpoints which did not benefit them all that well, and in some cases just held them back. The best way to experience God was through personal spirituality, not necessarily a custom someone else imposed on them. How would someone else know what any given pilgrim needed to communicate with a god? God spoke to everyone individually in one sense, with a lesson tailor-made for each person. Each person's practice was there inside him, just waiting to come out and flourish. It was time to liberate that practice. He reminded how God introduced himself to the ancients. I am what I am. Each person perceived him in a different way, and no authority could guess which form he would take. Personal spirituality was the only way to truly know him. Samuel had then explained that the animal sacrifices had made sense for a Bronze Age society based on agriculture and polytheism. They had been means to the end of believing in a personalized, abstract God. In the modern society, where people had become accustomed to an abstract God, worshippers no longer needed such props to help transition from polytheism to abstract monotheism. The stage had therefore been set to begin a program based on abstract spirituality, just as Samuel believed God had intended. He then made a reference to Jesus and prayed that spiritual seekers looking for personal spirituality be accepted by the traditional authorities. God had allowed one of his prophets to be executed for reinterpreting spirituality. It was up to the modern age to make sure that Jesus' sacrifice on Passover was not made in vain. The pilgrims had been flawed 6 days ago. Several of them had cried, having admitted to themselves that some aspects of the traditions weren't working for them, and they'd always wished they could tailor their rituals and traditions for their own growth. They had even been more flawed when Samuel had suggested that people spend time in communal silent meditation for a while, after which they would pair up and discuss what they needed for personal spirituality with the person next to them. They soon realized that, although they may have come from different traditions, all of them wanted the same type of thing. The people had left the Passover service in a good mood and convinced that they had experienced an epiphany. They clearly felt that a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders and that they had, in fact, been liberated. As the Kohen Gadol watched the new set of pilgrims coming in, he wondered what surprise Samuel was going to pull on them this time. Chapter 114, Deborah. April 10, 1996, 7th day of Passover. Al-Aqsa Mosque with Jerusalem Horcruxes left. 6. Harry, Tiara, Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Fatima Ahmadi never thought that she'd have to go through security this intense to get into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Yet here she was, waiting to pass through a metal detector with a whole bunch of other women. Several of them were tourists who had simply been curious as to what was in the mosque. When they had been told that there would be a serious Passover service in the mosque, and that visitors would only be welcome if they were dressed appropriately, joined the congregation, and behaved in a respectful manner, many of them left. One American complained that she wouldn't be caught dead in a burqa, and had left in a huff. Most of the people around her were Muslim. They had heard stories about the service 6 days earlier and had been pleasantly surprised by the ceremonies. The ceremony had been appropriate to all 3 monotheistic faiths, much as Samuel had claimed. The vast majority of people had been deeply moved by their experience. Furthermore, they had assured her that there would be no slaughtering of animals on site. She couldn't stand the sight of blood, and she had seriously considered not going if they were going to kill animals on the premises. She had never been to a Passover service before. Granted, the radio had spent years broadcasting anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic propaganda. Fatima, however, knew better. She was acquainted with many Jews, both men and women, and with a few exceptions here and there, they seemed to be as civilized as Muslims. Considering that religious Jewish and Muslim women tended to dress the same, with modest robes, snoods, and so forth, it was often hard to distinguish the two peoples. She figured it wouldn't hurt to learn more about the Jews so she could bolster herself against all this propaganda. She had never liked seeing the security outside the mosque. Granted, there were people of the other two monotheistic faiths who may have not approved having a mosque on top of the mountain, but it just seemed to defeat the purpose of a house of God. How dare someone bring violence into a building dedicated to peace and self-knowledge? She had just about reached the front of the line when something flew past her. It looked like a fly of some sort, or perhaps a bumblebee. She didn't recognize the species, though, as it was a glowing white. Whatever it was, though, probably had an eye for her blood. She instinctively reached out to swat it. The creature passed through the palm of her hand. She stared at her hand, astonished. She was about to ask the people behind her if they'd seen what she'd thought she'd seen when one of the guards came up to her and started frisking her. As usual, the guard, a woman, of course, apologized for the inconvenience. The guard didn't seem all that sincere about it. Either that, or she had said the same thing to the prior 100 people in line and was getting sick of it. Once through the security checkpoint, she took a burqa and program from one of the ushers, removed her shoes, and followed the other women up to the mosque and took a seat in the women's section. She could hear the men coming in on the other side of the room. She wouldn't get a chance to see much after all. There was a divider in the way, and she was only 52. Yet Samuel's speech supposedly was something you'd never forget. The room was mostly filled in when she saw the glowing bug again. She was relieved to discover that she hadn't gone crazy. Several other women had either tried to swat it or jump out of the way. Those who tried to swat it found, as she had, that it went straight through the palms of their hands. Unable to see much of the men's section, the women started looking at the object and talking about it. The person next to her had never seen anything like this before. All that she had been able to tell was that it looked like a ghostly white honeybee. It was probably something Samuel had been able to create. What happened next, however, brought enough of a gasp out of the women's section to actually quiet the men for a few minutes. The bee moved to the center of the hall. It hovered there for a moment, as if surveying the crowd. It slowly moved up and down, as if nodding. Then, in a span of maybe 2 seconds, it transformed itself into the figure of a woman. The woman was wearing a burqa, albeit one a little more liberal than the ones they had handed out at the security gate. She was short, maybe 5 feet if she was lucky. Her eyes were uncovered, and Fatima could see ringlets of wavy hair cascading down the sides of her face under her hood. She appeared to be in her 30s, and judging from the expression on her face, she seemed tough as nails. The burqa seemed relatively plain, its only adornment being what appeared to be a stitched-in image of a bee. The image wasn't easy to see, however, because of 2 complications. Her entire figure was translucent and glowing. She was a ghost. The women started talking excitedly among themselves as another woman slowly made her way to the front of the room and stood next to the glowing visitor. Who in Allah's name was this? It couldn't be Samuel, as word had gone out as to what Samuel looked like. Besides, what would Samuel be doing in the women's section? She'd find out soon enough, though. She wondered if this was another legend from the Quran. The glowing woman spoke in an unrecognizable language. She then turned to the woman standing next to her and nodded. "Ladies, it is my pleasure to introduce Angia, wife of Lapidot and mistress of Barak. You know her by her nickname, Deborah the Bee Woman. She served as the head mistress of Samuel's school when he was training to become a wizard. She is an animagus, a witch capable of transforming into an animal, with her animal form being that of a honeybee. She used her magical skills to great effect as she helped the ancient Israelites slowly conquer Canaan. She was best known for her strong organizational skills and her unorthodox feminist ideology. She was assassinated by powerful male authorities at the age of 53 and stayed around as a ghost to see how well the conquest and feminist movement worked out. I, Merakavod, will be serving as her interpreter. I have a doctorate in ancient Semitic languages from the University of Haifa." The women started to speak excitedly and started peppering Deborah with questions. However, Deborah shook her head and started waving her hands frantically. She then motioned for silence and pointed across to the men's section, where Samuel had just started giving his speech. The male interpreter closed to a standing ovation. Fatima was deeply moved by the speech. Samuel agreed with many of the things she had thought about spirituality and never dared admit. Could all three faiths have gotten off the tracks somehow over the past 3,000 years? At this point, Samuel started taking questions from the men in the audience. Many women raised their hands on Fatima's side of the room. However, Deborah smiled at them and started speaking once more. You can listen to Samuel if you want. However, there's something else I'd like to tell you which that bastard son of Hannah and Eli isn't going to tell you. There's another type of liberation Passover is supposed to commemorate. Liberation from gender stereotypes and from the overpowering rule of a patriarchal society. God created men and women as equals, did he not? If that's the case, how come we're shunted off to the side where can't even see the main attraction? We come to the sanctuary to worship God in our own way and are either kicked out of the services or stuck over here. That doesn't seem right, does it? Guess what happens when you do everything you put your mind to? Look at me, for example. I actually get to command armies, and do so in some cases better than those pig-headed soldiers who just want to show off their swords. Fatima listened in incredulity as Deborah gave one of the most surprising speeches Fatima had ever heard. The woman sounded like a cross between Gloria Steinem and Hillary Clinton. Judging from the commotion on the other side of the room, Samuel probably wasn't able to hear it. Considering Samuel's antiquated view of the world, that was probably good. The speech was interrupted, however, when Fatima heard shouting on the other side of the room. Deborah shushed the interpreter, shifted back into B form, and started hovering in the air so she could see over the divider. Fatima understood her reasoning. That was probably permissible as long as the men could not see her female form. A man was shouting angrily. Samuel, I heard your speech and agree with it wholeheartedly. You called upon us to liberate ourselves, and that's exactly what we're doing. We want your permission to take our town and request that it be returned to Israel. It's only a few miles east of Jerusalem. What else could be it part of? Samuel spoke, and the interpreter responded. It is disputed territory only at first glance, my friend. Both of the candidates worship the God of Abraham. As far as I'm concerned, we are all one people, and there is no need to fight. The first man wasn't convinced. Who are you to say this? Do you speak for God? There's a reason we're called the chosen people, Samuel. Hell, come to think of it, how do we know you're Samuel and not some charlatan? All you need to do is say some magical mumbo-jumbo and pass that off as ancient Hebrew. Then your accomplice here says what you want to say and thinks he has biblical authority. Dark mutterings started spreading throughout the room. Deborah lowered herself to the ground, flared into her human form, and skewered the women with a glare which immediately forced Fatima and her co-worshippers into submission. The interpreter's response was gentle. Sir, he is speaking what you would consider to be ancient Hebrew. I can attest to it. The man snorted. I doubt it. Samuel isn't the one who's talking to me here. You are. You can put whatever words you want in Casper the Friendly Ghost's mouth, and we wouldn't know any better. I'm sorry to hear that, but you may believe whatever you wish. However, I stand by my opinion. We are all children of Abraham, and it was about time the sects were reconciled. The man chuckled. If you were truly a child of Abraham, you'd follow God's orders and have sacrifices like it says in the Torah. I say you are an apostate and should be chucked from the temple. Who's with me? Who wants to bring God back to the temple and take out the heathens? The men's side erupted. Fatima heard punches being thrown all over the men's section. A chair smashed on someone's head. In the women's section, a couple of worshippers exchanged punches and had to be separated by other congregants. Then Samuel's voice, incredibly enhanced, exploded throughout the room. There was a gasp from the men's section. Fatima soon found out why. Samuel had levitated himself so he could be seen by both the men and women over the divider. You have brought violence into the temple. You have acted in ways which are a defamation of the faith of Abraham. I am a wizard, and I know who you are. Each of you who has thrown a punch during the past 5 minutes will be expected to pay 250 shekels to the upkeep of the temple in lieu of a sin offering. If you do not pay up within 1 month, you will be excommunicated from the faith of Abraham. The Pope has me as an advisor. The Kohen Gadol listens to me, and I have just received word that the Jewish sect's Orthodox Beit Din of Israel has accepted me as a supreme authority due to my strong grasp of ancient traditions. Rest assured, the excommunication will stick. There was dead silence. Someone whimpered in the back of the women's section. Deborah muttered something and pointed at Samuel. The female interpreter whispered, "He's going to do it. Trust me, he'll do it. He means business. When he gets like this, even people like Saul and Jonathan run." Samuel wasn't finished. "As for you, my antagonist, the instigator of this incident, you are fined 25,000 shekels and are excommunicated immediately. You have 5 minutes to leave the building or I will order the Kohen Gadol to expel you. Once you leave, you have until tomorrow night to leave the state of Israel. The Israeli Ministry of Magic will be under orders to execute you if they see you within its borders after that time." Chairs rustled and Samuel's glare sharpened. Anyone who attempts to assist the excommunicate will also be excommunicated. 4 minutes later, the man had left the building. One of the women who had participated in the fight had already brought out her checkbook. Fatima, who knew a bit of the Old Testament, suddenly realized what Saul had gone through after he had woken up Samuel without permission. Chapter 115. Sirius Vindicated. April 13, 1996, the Borough England Horcruxes left. 6. Harry, Tiara, Larket, Ring, Snake, Cup, Sirius Black was free at last. The official word had come down from the Ministry of Magic. After further investigation, Sirius was declared innocent of the deaths of Peter Pettigrew and the poor Muggles so many years ago. The latest issue of the Daily Prophet had reported his vindication and had warned that the government had a new most wanted man, Peter Pettigrew. There was no word of Voldemort, of course, but that was to be expected from the Ministry of Magic. As if that were not good enough, things got even better. Shortly after his release, he had received a message from Cornelius Fudge, personally apologizing for the incident. The message included a comment that would change Sirius's life forever. "In compensation for the 12 years you served undeservedly in Azkaban, the Ministry of Magic will be granting you a pension of 12,000 galleons per year for the rest of your life, payable 1,000 galleons per month." Sirius was rich. He could travel wherever he wanted and do whatever he wanted, even more so, considering that the statute of secrecy had been lifted. He could fly to Fiji if he so desired on his enchanted motorcycle and not have to worry about Muggles seeing him. He could donate money to Hogwarts, the school which had raised him. He had no idea how he'd be able to spend all that money. He had known immediately what he'd start spending on: a party. Ideally, he'd have wanted the party to be held at 12 Grimmauld Place, his ancestral home. Unfortunately, the building was the headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix and protected by the Fidelius charm. His second choice would have been Hogwarts, but there was no way Umbridge was going to allow a party during the middle of the semester. This left his third choice, the Burrow. The Burrow had seemed an unusual place for the celebration. However, it made sense. After all, his godson, who was still under house arrest, had to be there. Had it not been for Harry's interview with the Muggle and admission to using the time-turner, the world would have never learned the truth. The old house, so maligned by the Malfoys, was festooned with colorful lights. Candles floated in midair, and enough wizards were jammed into the living room that Harry had mentioned something about a fire hazard. Every single one of the Weasleys had returned for this. Percy had to come as a representative of the ministry. Fred and George visited simply to pay homage to one of the men who had written their wonderful map. Ron and Ginny, of course, were inseparable from Harry, once misses. Weasley had realized that most of her family would be in attendance. She brought out her strongest weapon, the guilt trip, and convinced the rest of her sons to visit. Bill's arrival had not been entirely without incident. He had been accompanied by Fleur de Lacre, the talented quarter-veeler who had participated in the Triwizard tournament. Needless to say, most of the men had swooned when she and Bill arrived. Sirius himself had tried to pick her up before Ginny intervened to call him off. Not everyone, however, was enthralled by Fleur, as was apparent when Sirius heard mutterings of phlegm in the background. Virtually all of Sirius and Harry's friends were there. Most of Hogwarts' senior staff, with the notable exceptions of Snape and Umbridge, had been invited as well, but every single one of them had been too busy. As far as Dumbledore had been concerned, even Sirius didn't know where Dumbledore was. He had sent out an invitation, but the great wizard had quite wisely, in Sirius's opinion, not written back, lest he reveal his whereabouts to the Ministry. Sirius had heard Fudge say that he was not going to rescind the warrant for Dumbledore's arrest. The old man had had it coming to him for a while, the minister claimed. He'd been a maverick for too long. This incident with the time-turner had been the straw that had broken the camel's back. Sirius was amused to see Fudge talking with Arthur. Arthur, of course, was now working for the Muggles and had had his memory wiped of most of his ministry work. The catch was that Fudge didn't know that his former employee had picked up the Bentley job. The minister was probably trying to figure out why Arthur looked so happy. Harry's two friends from the Shrieking Shack were also there. Hermione's parents, both Muggles, had come as well, curious to see what a wizarding house looked like now that the statute of secrecy was no longer in effect. Although Hermione no longer had a wand, she was more than capable of explaining the fundamentals of magic to her two stunned parents. Her mother had nearly fallen over when she had seen the dishes washing themselves. She had immediately turned on Hermione and asked her to buy a set for the Grangers. Hermione had said she'd look into it. Lupin and Tonks were there, of course. Sirius found it amusing that his former marauder buddy was spending more time staring at Tonks than talking to Sirius. This could be interesting, he thought. He hated to think what would happen when Lupin told Tonks that he was actually a werewolf. An amusing thought popped into his head. Remus Lupin with Nymphadora Tonks. Lupin could solemnly swear he was up to no good. There was a thud next to him. Sirius turned to see that Harry had taken a seat at his side. "Well, Godfather, I believe congratulations are in order. When will I be able to move in with you?" Sirius smiled. "As soon as you want, Harry. You'll have to finish your sentence of house arrest, though. There isn't much I can do about that. How much longer do you have?" Harry rolled his eyes. "I'm not sure, Sirius. Ouch." Both Sirius and Harry spun to see Creature the elf serving cake. Apparently the elf had been a bit clumsy and had poked Harry with a knife by accident. Creature took one look at Sirius and immediately began backing off. "I apologize, Master. Here, allow me to clean the wound. I think it's bleeding." Sirius nodded abruptly and reached into his pocket. "You'd better, or I'm going to be very angry. Here, use this handkerchief." Creature shook his head and withdrew a handkerchief of his own. "Don't worry, Master. I prepared for this eventuality." With that, he cleaned off the cut and put the bloody handkerchief somewhere in his robe. Apologizing once more, the clumsy elf walked away. Sirius shook his head and started working on Harry's cut with his wand. "I must admit, half the time I want to hug Creature and half the time I want to kill him. Now that Bella is dead, however, I suspect he'll start behaving much better around me." Harry laughed. "I doubt he can behave any worse, Sirius. At any rate, now that you're free, what are you going to do now? Become an Auror, teach at Hogwarts." Sirius laughed. "An Auror? I'd always wanted to be an Auror. However, I don't think I'd fit in very well, particularly because I'm a bit independent. Fortunately, I believe that I may be able to secure a similar position in the Muggle world." Harry got it immediately. "You want to join the SAS?" Sirius nodded. "Either them or the British Secret Service. They need good wizards, and I have combat experience. Furthermore, I'm familiar with most of the remaining Death Eater's tactics, so I'll be quite helpful in hunting them down. But the SAS is an elite military organization. They won't let in people of a more reckless nature. Besides, they'll see your criminal record. You won't get in. Sirius laughed. Believe me, once they realize I can cast spells and can disguise myself as a dog, they'll take me. Trust me, they'll take me. And as far as the criminal record went, it was wiped off the books when I was exonerated. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll need to talk to some more guests. Chapter 116. I can't believe I fell for this again. April 15, 1996, Malfoy Manor, England. Horcruxes left. 6. Harry, Tiara, Larket, Ring, Snake, Cup. The snap of an incoming apparition jolted Peter Pettigrew back to full awareness. He reeled back in shock, cursing himself for being so frightened. He'd felt bad betraying James and Lily to the Potters, and had felt worse when he had been forced to disguise himself as a rat to keep away from Voldemort's supporters. Now, things had gotten worse still. The entire wizarding world was supposedly looking for him now, having found out the truth about Sirius Black. Merlin's beard. Supposedly the Muggles were alerted as well now. Most of his allies were either dead or had defected. Normally, he wouldn't have given himself much of a chance. However, he knew something that the rest of the world didn't. The Death Eaters may be dead, but unless he was mistaken, he was on the verge of reviving the entire movement. All he needed was just one thing. He turned to face the newcomer. It was Lucius Malfoy. In his hand he held a small handkerchief stained with blood. Lucius was grinning with excitement. The plan worked perfectly. Creature infiltrated the burrow during Black's party and got some of Harry's blood. He handed the handkerchief to Rodolphus Lestrange, who had convinced Creature that he was acting on the late Bellatrix's authority. Rodolphus handed it to me, and now I give it to you. Just what he was hoping for, Pettigrew thought. He reached out and accepted the gift. Thank you, Mr. Malfoy. I take it everything is all set. Lucius nodded. The cauldron is set up in the living room. We're ready when you are, Wormtail. Trembling with both anxiety and excitement, Pettigrew led Lucius into the living room. One of the sofas had disappeared, having been replaced with a large black cauldron. The cauldron was filled with water, little ripples glittering like diamonds on the surface. Next to the cauldron stood Rodolphus Lestrange. The Death Eater had a naked child standing at his side. A child who looked very familiar, yet was not related to him. The child spoke with a rasping voice. Good, we're all here. Let's do it. Rodolphus lifted the child and gently lowered him into the cauldron. The cauldron began to bubble vigorously. Rodolphus then stepped aside as Pettigrew took center stage. Pettigrew reached into his pocket and retrieved the small fragment of burnt bone the late Philip Bullock had retrieved from Tom Riddle's tomb. He dropped it into the cauldron, and the contents began to bubble even faster. Bone of the father, unknowingly given, you will renew your son. Pettigrew then reached for his dagger. He knew what to do next, and that it would hurt. However, he had to do what he had to do. Gritting himself against the pain he knew which was coming, he chopped off a finger and tossed the finger into the cauldron. He figured the finger would be enough. After all, he had 8 others, and the Dark Lord would probably fix his hand again. Flesh of the servant, willingly given, you will revive your master. The pain nearly overwhelmed him. However, there was still one more thing he had to do. He took the handkerchief containing Harry's blood and dropped it into the cauldron. As soon as it touched the surface of the water, it began glowing as bright as the sun. Squinting his eyes, he finished the incantation. Blood of the enemy, forcibly taken, you will resurrect your foe. Smoke burst from the cauldron, making Pettigrew cough. Grimacing, Pettigrew fell to his knees. Rodolphus and Lucius followed suit. When the smoke cleared, it revealed the Dark Lord standing in the cauldron. There were a couple of differences this time around, however. This time, Voldemort healed the finger before speaking with the Death Eaters. And he didn't bother pressing anyone's mark, because all that would do would be to alert Snape and the other defectors that Voldemort had returned back at the burrow. Harry Potter was woken up by an insistent tapping on the window. It took a while for him to find his glasses, but find them he did. He got out of bed, puzzled. Who would be sending him mail in the middle of the night? It sure sounded like an owl on urgent delivery. In theory, the Ministry of Magic had oversight of all mail that went in and out of the burrow during Harry's imprisonment. However, the inspections had gone on for maybe a month or so. Once it became obvious that no one was going to send him contraband, they'd just given up and started to relax their supervision. Now, they just did a few random checks here and there, and even let Harry out of the house once to testify at the Dursleys' child abuse trial. He went over to the window and saw a most unusual sight. It was an owl, but it wasn't Hedwig. There was a large object hanging from its beak. It looked like a broom. Judging by the condition of the twigs at the end and the sleekness of the handle, it appeared to be a very fine broom. Harry grinned. It had to be serious. Now that he was rolling in dough, he had bought Harry an even better broom. He envisioned himself racing Draco Malfoy into the ground during his next Quidditch match, if he were ever permitted to play Quidditch again. There was an envelope hanging from the bottom of the broom. He picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a card with a simple greeting. It had been written in handwriting he had never seen before. "Here's a little surprise for you, my dear Harry. Sincerely, Sirius." Harry felt like he was floating in midair. It sounded like something Sirius would say. He didn't know why Sirius hadn't written it himself, but it didn't really matter. His godfather had helped him out once again. Throwing the card to the floor, he grasped hold of the broom. There was an abrupt jerk somewhere around his navel. The broom was a Portkey. A vague sense of discomfort began penetrating Harry's euphoria. Something sounded very fishy here. Instinctively, he reached for his wand, only to find that he had no wand. The guards had confiscated it. The Portkey deposited him with a thud inside a large, opulent room. There were 3 men in the chamber, standing alongside a chair facing away from him. A large cauldron sat in front of a fireplace. There was haze in the air, as if the cauldron had recently been used to brew a potion. Harry had a very bad feeling about this. The only time he'd seen a cauldron of that size was when Voldemort had been revived. Painfully aware of the fact that he was unarmed, he looked at the 3 men. He recognized 2 of them, Lucius Malfoy and Peter Pettigrew. Both of the Death Eaters were grinning at him evilly. He didn't recognize the 3rd man, but it was obvious from the man's facial expression that he shared the first 2 men's views. Then the chair next to the 3 men slowly swiveled around, revealing a man who had been sitting there. The man had serpentine face and pale skin. Harry knew that face. Shrieking in surprise, he reached for the broom. If he was lucky, it would Portkey him back to where he came from. If not, he'd fly out the window to safety so he could warn everyone. It's a pity he couldn't apparate. The Death Eaters laughed as he reached for the broom and unwrapped it. It fell apart in his hands, just a random jumble of branches and sticks. It hadn't been a broom. It had been a trap all along. They'd faked Sirius's signature that explained the handwriting differences. Voldemort chuckled. "They just don't make things like they used to, don't they, Harry?" Harry tried diving behind a chair. He'd gone maybe 1 foot when a Petrificus Totalis hex hit him in the chest. He toppled like a tree trunk, and his glasses flew off his head. He couldn't move. One of the Death Eaters reached down to turn him over as the others laughed. Squinting, he could see Voldemort towering over him, wand in hand. Voldemort shrugged. "Thank you for lowering the statute of secrecy for me, Harry. I'll be able to get more power this way. I'm already in charge of several Muggle terrorist groups and am well on my way to controlling countries. It's a pity you won't be around to see it, however." Voldemort spread his hands in mock resignation as Harry tried to speak and failed. "You don't need to say anything, Harry. I understand. I'm even learning more about the Muggles now. It makes sense for a good leader to know the people he's going to be ruling, right? At any rate, a Muggle phrase comes to mind here. What is it? Ah, yes. Voldemort narrowed his eyes and pointed his wand at Harry. As the Muggle police officer Arnold Schwarzenegger says, "Hasta la vista, baby." The Death Eater he didn't recognize nearly fell over laughing as Voldemort paused. However, if you're not familiar with that statement, let me translate it for you in a language you'll understand. The serpent-like mouth opened in a grin. Avada Kedavra. Harry had just enough time to think, "I can't believe I fell for this again," before the green beam hit him in the chest, and he was blasted into nothingness. Chapter 117, In Limbo. April 15, 1996, somewhere next path. 118 Nigel Marcellus, Horcruxes left. 5 Tiara, Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Harry Potter was dead. At least he thought so. He was surrounded by what appeared to be a featureless grey fog, almost as if he were flying through a cloud in an airplane. Was he in heaven? He certainly hoped so. He sure felt like he deserved heaven after having been subjected to that cheap, ignominious death at the hands of Voldemort. How would the world react to Voldemort's return? The Dark Lord would probably want to come back with a bang. He suspected that Minister Fudge would be in big trouble with both the Muggles and Wizards, having stated the whole time that Voldemort had been dead. If I were Voldemort, Harry mused, I'd visit the Ministry of Magic, get that prophecy I wanted to check out, wreak some havoc, and disappear before I could be caught. The Wizards would probably want to oust Fudge given what had happened. The big question would be whether Voldemort would do something to the Muggles. Voldemort had claimed that he had control of several terrorist groups and was trying to make inroads into various Muggle governments. Would he announce himself to the world via a magical terrorist attack? He could imagine the Muggles' reaction to a magical attack. Fires which couldn't be put out, monsters which couldn't be killed, and so forth. Things could get nasty in a hurry. He wondered what would cause more havoc, a global magical war or a global nuclear war. He wished he could go back there and warn everyone. Unfortunately, that option didn't appear to be available to him. He'd been hit in the chest by an Avada Kedavra curse, and he knew what that did. He was a goner. Get used to it, he told himself. You can't change the past unless you have a time turner, and you don't have a time turner. Could he come back as a ghost and warn people? The idea intrigued him. He certainly had information that the Muggles needed to know, and people in those situations often came back as ghosts. Perhaps he was a ghost already. Curious, he looked down at his body to check if it was glowing. It wasn't glowing. It looked just the same as it had been when he had been alive, except that he didn't have any clothes on. That ruled out the possibility that he was a ghost. Perhaps he had a body that only existed in heaven and would start to shimmer once he returned to Earth. If he was going to return as a ghost, he was going to need clothes. Seconds later, clothes materialized on his body. He stared at them incredulously. Where did those come from? Perhaps in heaven everything people asked for came true. He ruled thought out quickly, however, as he'd asked to become a ghost and hadn't returned to Earth. It looked like it was up to him to figure out how heaven worked. In order to do so, he'd have to find St. Peter, God, his father, or someone like that. It was time to go exploring. He walked through the fog for several minutes. He couldn't tell how far he had gone, or whether he had gone in circles. All he could tell was that he moving. After 10 minutes or so, the fog began to clear. Eventually, it cleared enough for him to figure out where he was. He was in King's Cross Station, near platform 934. Harry blinked. How the hell had he gotten over here? Did dead wizards get reincarnated as Muggles? That didn't make sense to him. Furthermore, if this was King's Cross, where was everybody? He traveled through the station several times with the Dursleys and knew that it was usually very crowded. This version of King's Cross was completely deserted. Well, almost completely deserted. He caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Grateful for the fact that he had at least one companion in heaven, he headed over to check out what had caused it. It was a small child, and it looked like he had been injured. It reminded him of what Voldemort had looked like before the Dark Lord had been revived in the little Hangleton graveyard. This couldn't be Voldemort, however, as he'd seen Voldemort back on Earth with his own two eyes. It had to be somebody else. Dreading to think what happened if someone died in heaven, he called out, "Hello, anyone around? Someone please help me. I'm new here and I've found an injured child. Oh, and if this is heaven, how do I become a ghost?" Seconds later, someone responded, "Leave the child alone, Harry. There's nothing you can do about him." Harry spun to face the speaker. The voice sounded very familiar. He'd only heard it once before, during the Priori Incantatum incident when he had been fighting with Voldemort after his first revival. Could it be who he thought it was? His suspicions had been correct. James Potter, his late father, was standing at his side, talking to him. Even more amazing was the fact that James didn't look like a ghost. As far as Harry could tell, James was alive. Harry's jaw dropped. "Dad." James nodded. "Yes, Harry, it's me. Welcome to Limbo, at least that's what we call it. It's where people go after they've been killed. The magic places you in King's Cross Station, after which you can take a train to continue on to the next phase of your soul's journey." Harry stared down at his feet. "So I'm dead after all. I was afraid of that. What do I do now?" James gestured at the platform. "Take a train. They stop by from time to time." "Where do they go?" "I am not permitted to say. Each soul has to find out for his or herself." "What did you do?" "I cannot say." "Can you go back? I want to go back as a ghost." James thought for a moment and looked at Harry more closely. "You probably can go back as a ghost. I don't know anyone who's done it, though. You'll have to ask some of the bigwigs here if you want to do that. However, there's something strange about your case. I've seen lots of dead people come through here over the years. To be honest with you, my ghostly senses seem to indicate that you're more alive than dead." James stared into the distance thoughtfully. "For all I know, you may be visiting Limbo in a dream or coma. Perhaps you're clinically dead enough for the magic to send you into Limbo, but revivable. You may get out of this alive, believe it or not." Harry stared at him. "Alive? How can I be alive? Voldemort's curse hit me in the chest." James nodded. "You survived after he hit you in the head when you were a baby, in case you don't remember." Harry's mind reeled. "True. Did I wind up in Limbo then?" "I don't know, Harry. I was busy with my own problems at the time, having just arrived in Limbo myself." Harry shook his head. "What did I do? How is this possible?" James shrugged. "I don't know, to be honest with you. However, if you are just visiting Limbo in a coma and will be able to return to Earth once you are revived, there's someone here I insist that you talk to. Your conversation with this person may very well determine whether or not Voldemort takes over the world." Harry's eyebrows shot up. "Wouldn't this person have to be dead for me to talk to him?" James nodded. "Yes, he's dead. Well, really dead in that he can't come back. You have actually met this person, believe it or not. He tried to kill you once, but he wasn't operating out of his own free will at the time. He's always wished he could apologize to you and avenge himself on the person who killed him." Harry nodded, intrigued. "Really? Sure, I'll talk to him. Who is it?" Another man's voice answered. "It is I, Mr. Potter." Harry turned to look at the newcomer. Another wizard had materialized in the station. He was bald and looked vaguely familiar. Harry couldn't place him at first. He then racked his mind for a few moments until it finally dawned on him who the new person was. He'd been thrown by the lack of a turban. Harry's jaw dropped. "Professor Quirrell." Quirrell nodded. "Yes, Mr. Potter. Quirinius Quirrell, your former defense against the dark arts teacher. I was possessed by Lord Voldemort shortly before your first year at Hogwarts and was forced to teach the course with Voldemort sticking out of the back of my head." Harry shuddered. "I remember all too well, Professor. At any rate, my father says you want to help me deal with Voldemort in case I'm actually visiting Limbo in a coma. How can you help me, Professor? I'm all ears." Quirrell smiled. "Voldemort may have been a powerful wizard, However, there was something he hadn't considered when he possessed me. When one man possesses another, both men are able to share each other's thoughts. I know lots of things about Voldemort that very few people know. The catch, of course, is that in order for me to take advantage of this information, Voldemort's spirit has to be exorcised. That would kill me before I would be able to do anything with it. Harry suddenly saw where this was going. Let me guess. You still remember all of Voldemort's secrets here in Limbo, and you're going to pass them on to me so I can go back to Earth and avenge you. Quirrell nodded. Correct, Mr. Potter. I know a lot of the tricks of the dark arts, both from Voldemort's possession and from my own studies for the defense against the dark arts position. I believe the information I am about to divulge will really throw Voldemort for a loop. James whistled as Harry smiled. Well then, Professor, what do you want me to know? Quirrell paused for a moment and drew a deep breath. Harry, have you ever heard of something called a Horcrux? Harry shook his head. I can't say I have, sir. I'm not surprised, Mr. Potter. It's a very arcane and dark branch of magic. Hogwarts doesn't allow the staff to teach it. At any rate, a Horcrux is a fragment of a wizard's soul trapped in an object other than the wizard's body. The wizard creates a Horcrux by splitting his soul, don't ask me how, I won't tell you, and hiding part of it in this object. As long as the Horcrux has the wizard's soul in it, the wizard cannot be permanently destroyed. If he is killed, he can be revived through an intricate ritual. One, unless I'm highly mistaken, you were involved with twice. Harry and James both stared at Quirrell. James finally broke the silence. You mean to tell me Voldemort survived all these years because he has a Horcrux? He went into Limbo or somewhere like that and was brought back through the ritual Harry was involved with. Yes, James. Voldemort created a set of 6 Horcruxes. All of these objects must be destroyed before Voldemort can be permanently dispatched. Each object must be destroyed using basilisk venom or some other powerful poison. James swore. 6. How the hell is Harry or Dumbledore, for that matter, going to find all of them? I suspect they're going to be guarded by magic only Voldemort can provide. Quirrell smirked. Simple, James. Remember that I know all of Voldemort's thoughts, knowledge which Voldemort had hoped would die with me. These thoughts, of course, include what the Horcruxes are and where they are. All you have to do is send various powerful wizards to those places, get through Voldemort's defenses, and destroy these objects. Harry grinned. He'd love to be part of a mission like this. Aloud. Sounds all right to me, assuming that I can go back. So what are these objects? Quirrell explained. First, there's Voldemort's diary. I don't know where that is. Harry smiled. I can answer that for you, sir. I destroyed it 3 years ago. The diary projected an image of Voldemort, and the image fought me in the Chamber of Secrets by summoning the basilisk hidden down there. I killed the basilisk and stabbed the diary with one of the basilisk's fangs, destroying the projection. Quirrell's eyes widened. Slowly, the professor bowed to Harry. Well done, Mr. Potter. I see you exhibit the bravery of Gryffindor quite well. At any rate, there are 5 others. There are 3 relics of Hogwarts which have been made into Horcruxes. Ravenclaw's missing tiara is in the room of hidden things in the room of requirement. It is a Horcrux. Salazar Slytherin's locket is hiding in a cave somewhere, I'm not sure where. You need to knock it out too. There's also Helga Hufflepuff's cup, which is currently sitting in the Lestrange's vault at Gringotts. Harry's mind raced. Is Gryffindor's sword a Horcrux too? No, Mr. Potter, it is not. The remaining 2 Horcruxes are Voldemort's familiar Nagini and a ring owned by one of his ancestors. I believe his last name was Gaunt. The ring's hiding out in the Gaunt's house. Nagini, of course, can move around, so I won't be able to pinpoint her. Quirrell leaned forward. Be careful of the snake, Mr. Potter. It's venomous. Furthermore, killing the snake with a device which is not impregnated with venom will not destroy the Horcrux. You'll just wind up with a snakeskin which has a Horcrux in it. James and Harry looked at each other, and Harry nodded one final time. It looks like I've got my work cut out for me then. I'll see what I can do to get the word out. First things first, however. I need to figure out how to get out of limbo alive. How do I do that? Quirrell shrugged. Tap your heels together 3 times and say there's no place like home, and hope the placebo effect will work here. Harry did so, and much to his surprise, the room started to dissolve. Both James and Quirrell smiled and bowed to him. Quirrell's voice echoed through Harry's ears as he disappeared. Good luck, Mr. Potter. Chapter 118. The Alliance for Magic. April 16, 1996, Marcellus Residence, London, England. Horcruxes left. 5. Tiara, Locket, Ring, Snake, Cup. Nigel Marcellus watched the morning news broadcast. As usual, it started off with the usual filth. Car crashes, fires, robberies, and so forth. Gore sold, and everybody knew it. He wondered how the news broadcasts would react to the really interesting stuff that he had been involved with as a former SAS agent, which, of course, he would never be allowed to divulge. How about accidental Soviet missile launch nearly triggers World War III, but catastrophe was averted thanks to some quick-thinking RAF officers? This would naturally be on the front page, of course. There would be a run on bomb shelters, radiation suits, and stuff like that. People would start fleeing the cities in droves. The Soviet premier would likely get a lot of egg on his face, and he'd probably start blabbing that it was an accident. No one would believe him, however, and tensions would rise between the two countries. What was truly interesting about this was the fact that the few RAF people who were familiar with the incident swore that the RAF hadn't been involved with it. They had no idea who had actually done the work to prevent the launch from becoming a catastrophe. This meant that the SAS had been given falsified information. But how could that be? Nigel remembered the incident vividly. He looked back to the dynamic photograph of Wizard Weasley's family in Egypt. Arthur had given it to him as a gift. Could it have been the wizards? Could the Muggles have prepared for war and tried to launch missiles only to have the wizards fix everything behind their backs? It certainly fit what he knew of the wizarding world before the statute of secrecy had been breached. The wizards had done the deed and convinced everyone it had been an RAF operation. The news continued. There was a traffic report. The major highways were backed up, as usual, followed by the weatherman reporting that the Greater London area would be lucky to break 10 degrees today. He joked that if you wanted reasonable temperatures, either wait a few months, get on an airplane, or send a letter to Cornelius Fudge. The television set flickered momentarily as the weatherman moved over to the radar display. Nigel swore. Was the cable having problems again? Their TV service, which had been excellent, had suddenly gone haywire about the time the wizards revealed themselves to the world. Nigel suspected that the wizards were casting spells out in the open and messing with all of the technology in the area. He made a mental note to contact Minister Fudge and ask him to do something about it. Suddenly, the signal disintegrated into noise, vaporizing the weatherman with his radar chart. Nigel scowled. He'd never seen it this bad before. He grabbed the remote control and changed the channel. More static. What the bloody hell was this? He headed over to the staircase and called downstairs to his wife. Claudia, can you turn on the tube up there for a second? My tube just went blank, and I want to make sure that it's the cable service and not the TV set. We've lost every single bloody channel. A few moments went by as Nigel watched the static on the screen. Eventually, his wife yelled back at him. It's the cable service, Nigel. I don't see anything either. Those morons should have fixed it a long time ago. Nigel shook his head and headed over to the phone. Oddly enough, the phone still worked. He called the cable service only to get a busy signal. His eyebrows shot up. He'd never heard of the entire service's switchboard being busy. His wife shouted once more as he sat down in front of the monitor. You know, Nigel, I think we've got a widespread problem here. I looked out the window at the Malsons across the street, and their TV isn't working either. It's not just us. Nigel chuckled. The wizards would get hell for this, he thought. He moved forward to turn off the television set. Suddenly, the static morphed into a banner showing a wand and a computer. Underneath it were the words, Tom Riddle, Wizard, Alliance for Magic Party. Nigel stared at the screen. Tom Riddle. It couldn't be that Tom Riddle, because the evil wizard by that name was dead. This must be someone else. Perhaps this Riddle was part of a minority political party who was running for the position of Ministry of Magic. He didn't see how advertising on a Muggle television set would help Riddle. He doubted that the Muggles were allowed to vote for Minister of Magic. The banner vanished, revealing a lavishly appointed room. There is a fireplace visible and a chandelier on the ceiling. Nigel whistled. Someone must have spent a pretty penny furnishing this office. His wife yelled up from downstairs. Nigel checked the tube. Something bloody strange is going on. Ever heard the name Tom Riddle before? Yes, Claudia. I know. I'm watching right now. A voice which sounded vaguely familiar burst from the screen. Attention, citizens of Britain. We apologize for the interruption, but we believe that in lieu of recent events, it is important that we make this announcement. Allow me to introduce my colleague and founder of the Alliance for Magic Party, Wizard Tom Riddle. The camera turned and revealed a tall, pale-faced man sitting in front of the fireplace. He was wearing a formal wizard's robe. Nigel snorted. This bloke didn't stand a chance. For one thing, he wasn't particularly photogenic. He was bald, with big eyes and a virtual slit for a nose. It looked almost as if a human woman had been impregnated by a snake. The man's robe was adorned, except for one rather ostentatious decoration, a George cross. Nigel whistled. This man must have helped rescue him and his co-workers. However, he could have sworn that he hadn't seen a man looking like this at the ceremony, which had awarded the George crosses. He vaguely remembered something about a man who looked like a snake. He remembered seeing it in an SAS dossier. He couldn't remember much about it, though. Then again, there were things on those dossiers he didn't want to remember. For some reason, Tom Riddle came to mind again, but this guy couldn't be him. No one survived a direct hit with a paveway. The man smiled for the camera. Nigel hoped that he could use magic to fix his teeth. He seemed supremely confident despite his abnormalities. He looked into the camera and began to speak. Citizens of Britain, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tom Riddle, and I am a wizard. I would like to announce my intention to make Britain a better place for both wizards and muggles. Traditionally, the wizards have been in a position of power, where they and they alone decide what parts of their world are exposed to the muggles. Now that the Ministry of Magic has been breached, we need to go to work making a society in which wizards and muggles both have a place. There are those in the Ministry of Magic who do not want me to tell you this. They want to keep control for themselves and not share it with muggles. They have tried to silence me several times, and in one case even asked a few muggles to help out. Rest assured, however, my mission will not be stopped. Those wizards can order you muggles to drop as many bombs on me as they want, but I will always come back to help the people of Britain. Nigel's jaw dropped when he heard that last sentence. He stared at the screen with an awful suspicion on his face. The camera focused on Riddle's face, and the man winked at the audience. That one wink confirmed Nigel's theory. Bloody hell, Nigel thought. It was that Tom Riddle. The evil wizard had survived Flying House. Nigel didn't know how, but he had, and he was now trying to establish a Muggle power base. Cripes, he thought. This was bad. Riddle was probably trying to get himself elected Prime Minister and betray the Muggles once he took office. It was a diabolically clever plan. What was even worse was that Nigel couldn't tell anyone what had really happened, because Flying House, indeed, the entire existence of the evil Tom Riddle as far as the Muggles were concerned, was still classified. Riddle pointed at the George cross on his robe. This object here is the George cross. I received this trying to help rescue Muggles from the Canary Wharf bombing. I suffered serious burns and scarring during the rescue, resulting in my current disfigurement. However, my magic didn't fail me, and I managed to free 6 people with my own wand. Rest assured, my dear friends, I nearly died for you that day." Slick bastard, Nigel thought. Now he's even explained why he looks funny. He suspected that Riddle had either conjured up a fake George cross or stolen it from someone in the ministry. "We of the Alliance for Magic Party are hoping for a system in which the Muggles and Wizards work together for mutual benefit. The Wizards make sure politicians don't go corrupt and do what they can to help the country run better. There's no way for the statute of secrecy to be restored at this point, and as a result, it would behoove both Wizards and Muggles to get to know each other better." Riddle smiled. "Now, I assume you want me to prove that I'm a wizard. Well, here we go." He raised his wand and shouted, "Avies!" A flock of birds suddenly burst from the wand and flew off-screen. He concluded his speech with a flourish. "Remember my name, Tom Riddle. Rest assured, I will do everything possible to ensure an easy transition into this brave new world. Support me, and we'll have a peaceful transition. Support someone else, and the wizarding authorities will probably get into fights with Muggles. Have a good day, everyone, and God save the Queen." With that, the Alliance for Magic banner disappeared. After a brief period of static, the weatherman came back, continuing his report as if nothing had happened. Nigel shook his head in disbelief. He couldn't believe this. Now Riddle would just blame any Death Eater attacks on the Ministry. Someone up in Sass was probably having a heart attack. Cornelius Fudge was probably trying to Avada Kedavra himself. He heard his wife call from downstairs. "Nigel, did you see that? This Riddle fellow may look strange, but he's got a point. We do need to start learning more about the wizards. I wonder if there's any way I can get in touch with him. Maybe Arthur Weasley knows him." Nigel didn't know what to say. All he could do is look at the television in horror. God would probably have to save the Queen, Nigel thought. He didn't think anyone else would be able to do it if Riddle actually took over. Chapter 119. Saudi Arabia Infiltrated. April 17, 1996. Main audience chamber. Royal Palace. Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Horcruxes left. 5. Tiara, locket, ring, snake, cup. King Fahd didn't like the news he was hearing from his Minister of Magic. Although it appeared that Habibi had indeed assassinated Osama bin Laden, he had managed to kill him off too late. The latest reports indicated that the new head of Al-Qaeda, a Sri Lankan man named Damit Haran Dilmi, was precisely the type of character Fahd had sent Habibi over there to keep out of Al-Qaeda. Habibi had not written back since the reports had come in that bin Laden was dead. He suspected that the agent had been killed by Dilmi during the Sri Lankans' takeover. Habibi had dutifully issued coded reports back to the Minister of Magic every couple of days. A delay like this was most unusual. Although Dagger admitted that he would likely never know what had become of Habibi, the minister had presumed the man dead. Habibi had been an extremely skilled wizard, according to Dagger. However, the man who had taken him out had a rap sheet which could have spanned the peninsula. Dilmi had been involved with a group known as the Death Eaters, a radical wizarding faction based primarily in Great Britain. The Death Eaters believed that wizards were superior to Muggles, and that it was the duty of the Muggles to submit to the wizards. Many of them were prejudiced against wizards who were not of pure blood, which didn't make much sense, as blood status appeared to be irrelevant when it came to determining the success or power of a particular witch or wizard. Dilmi, 59, had been involved in the Death Eater movement from the beginning. He admired the confidence and power projected by the movement's founder, an exceptionally powerful British warlock named Tom Riddle, who often went by the name Lord Voldemort. He had come to England on a regular basis to assist the Death Eaters in their attempted takeover of the British Ministry of Magic, as well as the persecution of half-blood and Muggle-born wizards. The Death Eater movement fell apart in 1981, when Riddle was mysteriously killed trying to kill an infant. People defected in droves, and the Death Eaters who remained faithful to the cause were eventually rounded up and incarcerated in Britain's maximum security Azkaban prison. Azkaban was about as forbidding a place as Dagger's own high-security prison in the Rub al Khali. If anything, it was worse. It was guarded by dementors, terrible creatures which Dagger refused to allow anywhere near Fard's kingdom. Voldemort's movement had lain dormant until the middle of last year, when there was an unprecedented mass breakout from Azkaban. Many of the Death Eaters had escaped, including Dilmy. Dilmy had returned home to Sri Lanka and started his own Death Eater chapter. Supposedly, Dilmy had had plans to attack the central bank in Colombo. Thanks to the grace of Allah, that attack never took place. However, Dilmy was able to spend a lot of time slowly recruiting men for the Death Eater movement. As if that were not bad enough, there were conflicting reports coming out of England that Riddle had resurfaced. Although the British Ministry of Magic denied it, several unofficial sources claimed that the evil Archmage had returned and was once again plotting mischief and mayhem. These sources, supposedly from inside the ministry, had reported a gathering of Riddle, and the Death Eaters had been targeted by an SAS bomb strike about the time Fard had interviewed Wizard Malfoy. Everyone was quickly convinced that Riddle had been finished off for good. However, some things didn't add up. Dagger reported that Dilmy had been funneling a whole platoon of Sri Lankan Death Eaters into England. Perhaps Dilmy had been thinking of succeeding Riddle as the head of the movement. The movement had certainly needed more British members, as most of them had been knocked out by the SAS attack. All of the signs had been indicating that Dilmy was planning some kind of magical terror attack using Al-Qaeda. Dilmy certainly had a motive: to avenge his mentor Riddle. Whether the attack would actually succeed was still an open question. All of the Saudi ministry's theories had come crashing down, however, less than 24 hours earlier, when a man who looked a lot like Tom Riddle took over all of the British airwaves in an attempt to establish a Muggle power base. Riddle's announcement had caught the BBC and other British broadcasting authorities completely off guard. He claimed that most wizards were elitist and wanted to stay apart from Muggles. Riddle, on the other hand, positioned himself as the Muggles' ally. He had formed what appeared to be a political party, the Alliance for Magic, to try to get his message across. Riddle apparently had managed to earn a George Cross, as he had supposedly worn one during the broadcast. He claimed that he had received the award and a seriously bodily disfigurement, rescuing Muggles during an era terrorist attack. Dagger, however, didn't buy it. The Saudi minister had told Fard that Riddle had probably killed a man who had earned the cross and stolen it to use in the commercial. His British informants explained that Riddle's commercial had neatly hamstrung virtually all of the authorities who knew that Riddle was in fact an evil wizard who was just trying to gain power. The SAS presumably knew, but they had likely classified the information so they couldn't divulge it. The ministry knew, but Cornelius Fudge would have got himself into big trouble admitting that he knew that Voldemort had been around the whole time and didn't tell anyone. The British government, as a result, never officially commented on the commercial. This, of course, was exactly what Riddle had been counting on. Supposedly, several hundred men had already joined the Alliance for Magic, with hundreds more undoubtedly on the way. And that was just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. Fard shook his head. Tom Riddle was an absolute genius, an assessment immediately confirmed by Dagger. At the rate things were going, he'd soon be in control of Al-Qaeda as well as possibly a good portion of the British population. This guy had to be taken out. However, doing so would be tricky. After all, Saudi Arabia and Britain weren't exactly enemies. If the world found out that a Saudi agent had assassinated a populist British political leader, there would be absolute hell to pay. Fard couldn't take out Riddle. Dagger couldn't either. However, there was one person who might just be in a position to do it. The king had been reluctant to get involved with this man, but he figured he had no choice. Riddle's assassin had to be involved with the British Ministry of Magic, and as luck would have it, he knew someone who worked for that ministry. 2 hours later, Lucius Malfoy walked into the audience chamber and bowed. You asked to see me, your majesty. The king nodded. Yes, Wizard Malfoy, I was wondering if you could do me a favor. Lucius frowned. A favor? What do you mean, your majesty? It's simple. You work for the British Ministry of Magic, do you not? The Briton nodded. Yes, your majesty, I do. I've been working for the ministry for a while. Good, Wizard Malfoy. Are you familiar with a man by the name of Tom Riddle? For a moment, Fard thought he'd caught a glimpse of triumph on Malfoy's face. However, it disappeared so quickly he wondered if he'd imagined it. Malfoy thought for a moment and answered, I believe I do, your majesty. He's a wizarding political leader who's trying to endear himself to the Muggles. Fard stared at Malfoy more intently. I assume that the ministry is aware of his other role as Lord Voldemort. Malfoy looked at his shoes. He seemed uncomfortable or a very good liar. As a matter of fact, we are aware of his alter ego as well. Tom Riddle is a very dangerous and popular man, your majesty. One of his agents may be in charge of Al-Qaeda if my memory serves me right. Fard whistled. You definitely know your stuff, Wizard Malfoy. At any rate, I was hoping whether you and I could form an alliance which could be used to send Lord Voldemort to Allah prematurely. I need Riddle out of there because his flunky is running Al-Qaeda, and you need him dead because he's going to be interfering with your nation. A Saudi agent can't kill him because it would be an international scandal. Malfoy thought for a moment and shook his head. As a member of the Ministry of Magic, I cannot serve any foreign power. I am sorry, your majesty. Fard smiled. Not if it's unofficial. You give me Riddle's head, I give Britain a lot of money and oil. Simple as that. Can't your Ministry of Magic do it? Fard shook his head. We don't assassinate foreign political leaders. You'll have to do it for us off the record. Malfoy hesitated, but eventually nodded. I believe that may work, your majesty, as long as it's all off the record. However, I will be needed at the ministry most of the time. Would it be all right for one of my colleagues to become part of your cabinet? He'll be around all the time to talk to you. You can summon him whenever you want. That will be fine. What's his name? Amram Rickpreet. He's a Hindu, your majesty. I assume having a Hindu in your cabinet will be all right. I don't want to offend anyone. The king shook his head. Normally, I'd be a bit reluctant to add some Hindus to my cabinet. However, Riddle is enough of a problem that I'm willing to make an exception here. Malfoy nodded. Then it is settled. I'll send him over as soon as possible. That's all I can ask for, Wizard Malfoy. Good luck, and may Allah go with you. Dismissed. Chapter 120. The Genetics of Magic. April 17, 1996, Biology Lab, University of Seoul, South Korea. Horcruxes left. 5. Tiara, locket, ring, snake, cup. Cha Jung looked over at the computer printout. Normally, genetic samples from 3 randomly chosen people would be highly different. There were the X and Y chromosomes, of course, which would differ between men and women. Other sequences of nucleotides would vary as well. Granted, with the Human Genome Project nowhere near finished, there was no way to tell what exactly each gene did. Some of them would be responsible for hair color. Others would be responsible for freckles or heart disease. A few weeks ago, his advisor had given him, and the rest of his postdoc friends, 2 interesting genetic samples, one from a Korean witch, and one from a man who supposedly had some magical skills, and not others. Both spellcasters had defected from North Korea a while back, and had given blood samples for the sake of science. The goal was to figure out which genes and nucleotides were responsible for wizarding ability. The only way to determine this would be to grab a whole bunch of Muggles, say 50 or 60, and have them donate blood samples. In theory, all one needed to do was to take the blood samples of the witch, the so-called half-wizard, and the Muggle, and make a list of which genes were in both wizards and not in the Muggle. The catch, of course, was that with only 3 samples, there would be lots and lots of genes which would qualify. Some of them could be responsible for hair color, and some could be responsible for heart disease. There would be no way to tell with just 3 samples. However, if the scientists checked 62 blood samples and found that the only 2 which had a particular sequence were the 2 wizards, then they'd be onto something. As it so happened, they had more than 60 volunteers. Graduate students were notorious for having low incomes, and they often needed to earn money any way they could. Their little advertisement had managed to recruit no fewer than 217 men and women. All of them were Korean. They had insisted on that to make sure that the experimenters were changing as few variables as possible. Cha Jung had even managed to include a few professors as well. It had taken a while, but the results had finally come in. The computer had just produced a list of genes which only the 2 wizards had and no one else did. The list had a very surprising and worrisome number of entries. This was impossible, he thought. The few wizards he had spoken to believed that wizarding ability was hereditary. This meant at least some genetic component. But if that was the case, where was it? Where were the genes that made someone a wizard? They had to be there. It took him a good half an hour of racking his brain before he realized what had probably happened. The key was the half-wizard. The man had no idea that he had had wizarding abilities, yet there he was casting spells. As far as he knew, he was a Muggle. He had been quite surprised when his teacher had informed him that he was able to become a wizard if he so chose. The half-wizard's situation suggested a stunning possibility. His group had selected volunteers who were Muggles and only Muggles. He had to consider the possibility that some of these Muggles were half-wizards, like the North Korean man, and didn't know it. That would likely skew the results. He hurried back to the computer and looked for genes which were shared by the 2 wizards and the fewest number of Muggles. This would help isolate things a little further. The computer chugged for a moment and eventually spit out its result. Cha Jung frowned. That didn't make sense, he thought. He went outside to think things over again when he came across a third possibility. Perhaps all humans had these genes, but only wizards had chemicals which activated them. If that was the case, magical ability was probably latent in every single human being and could in theory be triggered at the right time of fetal development. The females with the Y chromosome came to mind. They shared the Y chromosome with males, but if the chemicals in their blood didn't trigger the Y to activate, the people in question stayed female. So he went back to the computer and brought up the blood chemistry statistics. Were there chemicals in the wizard's blood which were in none of the Muggles' blood? That would probably help a lot. The computer thought about it some more and reported its result. Exasperated, he extended the search to include chemicals which were included in the wizard's blood and appeared in 2 or fewer Muggles. If this didn't work, he thought, he'd have to really get creative. The computer thought some more and suddenly beeped. Cha Jung's eyebrows shot up. This meant a positive result. A couple of seconds later, the machine reported its results. There was one compound which was shared by both the wizards and by one of the Muggles. One compound was shared by only the witch and one Muggle, but it was not the same Muggle. There were no compounds which were in the blood of the half-wizard and one Muggle which were not also in the witch's blood. He looked into the computer databases for information about these compounds and found some very interesting results. Supposedly, they had just been discovered within the past few months, in all likelihood after the wizards had revealed themselves to the world. He suspected that other labs were trying to do the same thing he did and identify wizarding biological components. The compound shared by the Muggle and both wizards had been given the provisional designation, QACT. The reports claimed that there were 2 compounds which seemed to control magical abilities, Q and Z. It was unknown how exactly Q and Z worked. What was obvious, however, was that the chemical his lab had isolated was involved with activating Q. Breathless with excitement, he looked up the information on the second compound. It had no name. Which DNA sequence did it activate, Q or Z? Was it related to both? He needed more information, so he dug deeper. Eventually, he picked up something hiding on page 16 of a 24-page report. It claimed that the compound with no name seemed to be extremely common in those with an active Z chromosome and nowhere else. Cha Jung suddenly realized what this meant. He needed to double-check things to be sure, but the conclusion made a lot of sense. An active Q gene was responsible for the ability to cast magical spells. Both the half-wizard and the witch had this ability, as did, oddly enough, one of the Muggles. This seemed to indicate a proportion of magic-capable people in the general population of about 1%. On the other hand, the Z gene was likely responsible for the ability to see magical constructs. The witch had it, as did one Muggle, but the half-wizard didn't. What could the witch do and the half-wizard not do? See magical constructs. He suspected that in order to be identified as a wizard, a person needed both the Z gene and Q gene activated. All people with at least one gene inactive would likely have been classified as a Muggle. It was telling that, although there were a few Qs and Zs running around in the list of samples, none of the Muggles actually had both. This made sense. There would be probably many more half-wizards than true wizards. Judging from this simple test, maybe 2% of the population was a half-wizard with one gene activated, and 1 out of every 10,000 was a full wizard. He still wasn't entirely certain whether Q and Z genes were in the human genome. However, he had a strong suspicion he knew what they did. He had to report this to the head of the lab immediately. This was big news. He'd have to do some more experiments to see if there were any other compounds like these. He wondered if the two Muggles who had been identified in the experiment realized that they were about to be hit with the biggest surprise of their lives.